Okay, let's get started. I'm Caitlin Coleman, Water Education Colorado's Publications and Digital Resources Managing Editor. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to bring you this webinar, which is a little bit different than webinars we've offered in the past. Typically, we try to offer a big panel discussion with a variety of perspectives, but this will be fun to dive in deeply for a discussion between our moderator or host, Brett Bovee, with WestWater Research, and Adam Jokerst with the City of Greeley. And I want to leave plenty of time for them to talk and for you to ask them questions. But a few housekeeping notes as we get started. So one, if you aren't familiar with Zoom, you should have buttons at the top of your screen where you can adjust who you see on the screen. And I'll try to highlight our speakers once they start really talking. But if that's not working for you, you can select the speaker view option so you can focus on them and not everyone else here. Also, you guys are muted now, so as attendees, just try to remain muted throughout the presentation so we can just focus on the presenters. If you want to communicate with each other or with me or with our speakers, you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Usually, maybe it's somewhere else on your screen, and I'll try to help. I'll try to monitor that and help with any technical issues or questions. And of course, the webinar is being recorded, so we will share that after the fact. So during the last 15 minutes or so of our time together, we'll move into an audience question and answer session. So you can, if you don't have your camera on already, you can turn your camera on at that point and then use the little raise hand reaction button for me to call on you. And then we'll filter through your questions, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can type questions into the chat box. And I can remind you of the Q&A protocol later. So for now, let's get started. For us at Water Education Colorado, we thought that this Municipal Water Challenges topic tied in nicely with our brand new spring 2021 issue of Headwaters magazine, which is focused on water storage. We tried to organize a webinar or 2 or 3 to take each issue off the page and dive deeper into the subject matter that we present in the printed magazine. And as you can see very small on the screen, we had just a little profile about Greeley and talked a little bit about their work there, but we're really excited to hear a lot more about everything they have going on beyond just the Terry Ranch project. And Brett actually approached us about this webinar idea, so it's perfect and is going to be great to learn more. So if you're interested in water storage issues beyond what you hear today, I encourage you to flip through the issue or check your mailbox. You may have received it already, or it could be waiting for you there today. And I think with that, I will just hand it over to Brett, and you guys can get started and take it from there.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, I'm excited to talk to Adam today. So just to give you an overview of what we plan to cover, the general idea of the webinar today is that the Front Range region of Colorado is experiencing significant growth, and the demographer and kind of all metrics point to continued growth for the next few decades. And it's the role of municipal water providers and municipal water utilities to serve those new demands that are associated with that growth, that population growth that we're expecting to experience. And managing reliable water supplies, developing new water supplies feels like it's only getting more challenging. And so I thought it would be really interesting and informative to talk about a couple topics with Adam today. The process of a municipal water utility servicing new land development, new housing projects, sort of how one example utility, Greeley Water, has historically served customers, and what the future kind of looks like for Greeley, because they're doing some pretty innovative and creative things in terms of water supply development. So that's what we hope to cover today. As Caitlin said, hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But a little background on my knowing Adam. We actually worked together about 10, 12 years ago at an engineering firm. And I'll share a little story just to kick things off. When I was preparing, I remembered a trip that Adam and I were on where we were in Utah, looking at maybe some reservoir sites, and it was the end of a field day, and we sort of took the long way back to the hotel, and we're driving on some snow-packed Forest Service roads. And I was driving, and I think I was looking off in the distance and took a turn wrong, and I plowed the front tire into a ditch on the side of the road, and we were a solid 45-minute drive from anyone. And I remember it, after about a half hour, 20 minutes of work, we got out and went down. But it was a fun experience that I kind of feel like Adam was a good luck charm, getting me out of a messy situation. So yeah, Adam and I have known each other for a while now. But beyond my little story, Adam, why don't you give a little background on your experience with water resources and water utilities in Colorado?
Well, thanks, Brett, for that introduction. I had forgotten about that until now. And for the record, I did most of the digging and Brett did most of the driving. Hey, thanks to WECO for holding this event. I feel honored to be able to speak to you all today. And thanks for that introduction, Brett. I've worked in the municipal sector for coming up on 10 years, 6 years at the city of Fort Collins, 3 years at Greeley, and before that worked in the private sector. My role in municipalities has largely been focused on water resources and new supply development. I led Fort Collins in their pursuit to enlarge the Halligan Reservoir, and then at Greeley, I am deputy director and I oversee water resource operations, long-range water supply planning, our acquisition program, storage development, and water conservation, among others. And I look forward to talking about some of the questions on being a municipal water provider.
Yeah, so I guess my first question, kind of interested in your experience, because I've never worked for a municipal water utility, so I've never kind of been behind the scenes, but I do think it's fascinating the job that municipal water utilities do, not just in Colorado, but sort of nationwide in sort of providing reliable, high quality water supplies at people's taps in faucets. And it's such a good job. And this has been, documented in news outlets before, but the utilities generally do such a good job that we take it for granted. And most people don't see the underlying complexity and headaches that go into continuing to provide that service. So for someone who is sort of behind the scenes, what do you admire most about sort of how Greeley operates or how municipal water utilities operate that you sort of learned in the process of working with municipal water utilities?
I think you're right that a lot of folks do take it for granted. And part of that is all of our infrastructure is underground. It's out of the public view. And typically it always works. People get water 24/7, 365. There's just an expectation that water is going to come out of the tap all the time. But I guess, one of the greatest joys of working for a municipality is that my work translates into direct impacts on the community. The projects and the policies and the programs that my team run directly benefit me, my neighbors, my friends, my family, and that's really rewarding. It's also nice being the client. Having worked in the private sector, it is nice being the client because, I've been frustrated as a consultant that the client was unwilling to change or, explore new options. And in the public sector, we get to make those calls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, as we'll talk about, I mean, you and your team have done some cool things in recent years to sort of get creative around storage and water supplies in general. So, I mean, one of the overarching themes that we'll touch upon today is this, that the Front Range is experiencing growth. And I'll have some charts that show this, but before we get into sort of the growth in water supplies, I thought maybe we could just chat about this process of serving a new housing development. I mean, when we drive I-25 or some of the other major highways on the Front Range, you know, we look out our window and we see new homes being built in, you know, often subdivisions or planned projects. I think it's an interesting agreement to understand how a municipal water utility agrees to serve a new development and what that new development's obligations are to receive that service. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk generally about that and maybe provide an example of how Greeley does it with new developments.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of growth, both, I mean, up and down the Front Range and the West Slope and in Greeley. And I think this is common for most water providers, municipal water providers, domestic water providers, is that growth, we require growth to pay their own way. And we require that new development brings water because new development creates a new obligation for a water provider. It increases our water demands. And when we issue a new water tap to a house or a industry, we are making a perpetual agreement that will provide that tap 24/7, 365, forever, in good years and in drought years. And so in most cases I'm aware of, new growth has to bring that water, or for many cities, the cash equivalent to purchase that water before we'll issue a new water tap. What that means is that developers are out on the water market purchasing water rights. And many cities do that as well, and it creates a market. Specifically for Greeley, what that means is that when a new development is encumbered, meaning the city approves it, we require a certain amount of raw water dedication. And that's either in the form of water rights, cash, or raw water credits. And the raw water credits are part of that Terry Ranch project that we'll talk about later. For example, Greeley requires 3 acre-feet per acre for single family development. And we base that on the amount of water that we expect the customers to use. In commercial and multifamily, we actually calculated on a per unit basis or what type of development. We get very specific on multifamily and commercial. Sometimes the developer pays the raw water dedication at the time of encumbrance. Sometimes the home builder builds it, but regardless, we require water, cash, or credit before we issue a new water tap.
Mm-hmm. And from, I guess, recent years, do developers, housing developers, do they seem to prefer to pay a utility cash, or would they prefer to acquire those water rights on their own and dedicate them?
I think developers will always do what is the cheapest.
Yeah.
You know, each city has their own policy. Each, you know, water provider has their own policy. Some only accept water. Mm-hmm. Some accept cash and water, and the cash rates are all different. Mm-hmm. For example, Greeley charges $36,500 per acre foot as a cash in lieu of water rights. So it's the cash price for an acre foot of dedication. Other cities charge 60, 70 or more thousand. Mm-hmm. And that's really based on the water portfolio that each city already has. There is a discrepancy in the North Front Range, and I expect all over Colorado, that the older cities have more senior rights. They've been able to develop a water supply portfolio over time that's probably developed in much cheaper than it would be to do that today. And so older cities are able to pass along that savings to new development because we have a very diverse supply that was developed cheaply. New cities, they require that the water is turned in to supply that new home being built.
Mhm.
And that can be very expensive. And so that's why you just see that discrepancy.
Yep. So is it fair to say it's your job to take the cash? Let's say a developer pays you $31,000 per acre foot. You and your team, partly it's your job to take that cash and turn it into a reliable water supply so that those new taps, new service commitments can be served, like you said, in perpetuity, right?
That's right.
Uh-huh.
You know, our cash is pegged, our cash rate is pegged both to the acquisition of new water, the acquisition of storage, and the buy-in to the portfolio that we already had, that we've already developed. That's just Greeley. Others require a cash value to immediately turn around and go buy the water.
Yep.
And so their cash rate is based on the market of water rights that are currently out there. Again, that's what I think distinguishes and why there's this discrepancy in the cash rate between cities.
So with the growth, you know, being projected and people seeing growth happening, with what we just talked about that process, if I'm a homeowner and I'm in, you know, City of Greeley utility service area, you know, should I be concerned about new growth impacting my water supply or not? I mean, is there any validity to a fear that all this growth is going to impact the water available at my home?
I think municipal water providers would never issue a new tap if it risked providing water to the customers we already have. That's the goal.
Yeah.
And that's again,
the
because
growth.
of that
Yeah.
growth pays for its own way.
Yeah.
And that's because we've made that perpetual obligation when we issued that tap in the first place. But you know, should residents be concerned about growth? Well, I guess that depends on whether you want to see or don't want to see growth. And I know that's a contentious issue across Colorado. And water providers often get drug into that debate. And
Right.
I don't think that's fair, because water providers, for the most part, we're not out there creating growth. Often cities are the ones, the city council or the economic development departments are the ones who are attracting growth. We just respond to it. We look at what the future the water demand is going to be based on state demographer projections and city policies, and we develop a water supply to meet that future water demand. Easier said than done, but that bottom line is that new water sources have to be developed to grow, and there's just only so much water out there.
That is a perfect segue into a couple, our chart I want to show. Let me pull it up here. Are you seeing that, hopefully? Yep. So speaking of state demographer projections, this is Larimer and Weld counties. Blue line is back to 1985. The green line is sort of their projection data out to 2050. So just to give a sense of where the state demographer, basically, I would say the brightest mind on where our local population is going to go, we're currently around 700,000 people in Larimer and Weld counties around 2020. And the projection, this green line shows, is pretty consistent growth through 2050, up to about 1.2 million people over the next 30 years to 2050. So 30 years is roughly a generation. So in another generation, you know, we are expecting to not quite double, but get darn close to doubling our population in our area, which I think is a big challenge in the water space. The other chart I wanted to show was this growth projection. To me, is sort of contrasted by where we find ourselves sitting today in terms of homes. So I have two charts I wanted to show, and this data is from the Colorado Association of Realtors. I have the link at the bottom there. You can go to their website and just pull this data yourself. But there is a huge lack of homes right now in Larimer and Weld counties. So what I have in red here is the inventory of homes for sale and the months of supply of inventory. And what I want to highlight is this percent reduction sort of year over year. So in April of this year, both Larimer and Weld County saw basically over half of reduction in the number of homes for sale. And we know there's pressures to for people who want to live in this area, and that the population projection shows that. But at the same time today, at this very moment in time, we see a real lack of housing available for people to move to our area. So it'll be interesting to see how, and I'll show you one other sort of chart on this. This is a chart of vacant developed lots, which are basically recorded plats with streets and utilities all platted out and in place. So homes are ready to be built. And this is vacant developed lots in Larimer and Weld counties going back to about 2010. And it's through the third quarter of 2020. You can just see that the vacant developed lots, sort of lots waiting for homes to be built, has really been down over the last 10 years. In Larimer and in Weld counties. Now there seems to be some recovery, and maybe this is a sign that things are going to pick up, but both the inventory of homes for sale and this chart really show that we don't seem to be building homes fast enough. And so that interplay between how fast can developers develop homes and will we actually realize some of those population growth projections? That'll be very interesting just to see play out over time. And before I move on, Adam, I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of these two contrasting pieces of data. One, yeah, we expect to grow basically as fast as homes can be built. And the other metric being, it seems to be slow to build homes in these two counties in sort of the northern Colorado area.
It's very true, but I do think there's a lag in the market, and developers respond to demand. And my observation, at least in Weld County, is that there's a large amount of housing set to take off. Is that enough? Probably not. But as long as Colorado stays a good place to live, and it is.
Yeah.
As long as there's the economic activity to support the jobs, which there certainly appears currently that there will be, I think we'll continue to see this growth. And I do think that the state demographer has some of these data points in their projections. I hear folks say, well, it's going to get too expensive to live here. California has been saying that for 30 years, yet they've grown quite a bit over that time until recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I did want to provide this perspective on sort of the water side of growth. And, I think I feel like a lot of our growth in northern Colorado has really been available or able to be done because of the Colorado Big Thompson project. And that project, I guess more than any other single water supply, has provided the water to allow a lot of communities to grow almost with I guess, minimal thought on water supply. It was a source they could always turn to. And there was basically, to lay some background, this is a project built from the 1930s to the 1950s that brings water over from the Fraser Granby area through a series of large reservoirs and a large tunnel. And what you see it as is Horsetooth Reservoir and Carter Lake on the Front Range. That's sort of the eastern side reservoirs. And then there's a series of pipelines from there and to bring that water out to different communities. But the project originally was established with a lot of agricultural ownership, something like 80 to 90% ag ownership. And over the time since it was built in the 50s or completed in the 50s, A lot of municipal communities in northern Colorado could simply find contract units, shares in a sense, of that project to purchase, and all the infrastructure was set up for them just to take more water once they acquired the shares to do so. And it, from developers' perspective, from municipal water utilities perspective, it was a very easy way to secure new supply. Like I said, the treatment plants were built basically at the toe of those reservoirs, both at Cutter Lake and Horsetooth Reservoir. And so the infrastructure costs, the regulatory costs were all very minimal. But where we find ourselves today is that was a real helpful supply to grow for decades. But currently, something like 90%, 80 to 80% maybe of Colorado Big Thompson project units are already owned by the municipal utilities. And the buckets left, are owned by large irrigation companies, or may not find their way to municipal ownership. So that source that northern Colorado generally has relied upon for a long time is really not going to be there looking forward. And I think a lot of communities have seen this, and it's one reason the Northern Integrated Supply Project exists. It's one reason I think other projects are getting off the ground now, sort of more localized projects to pump groundwater and augment, or things of that nature. But I was curious, Adam, for you working for Greeley, how much has Greeley relied upon the CBT system for historical water supply and growth? And then its sister project, maybe the Windy Gap project. How much has Greeley relied upon that? And then I'll ask you about other sources too.
Yeah, we rely heavily on the CBT project. Greeley is the largest municipal owner of CBT units. We own about 23,000 units out of 300,000 or so of the available units. We're also a large owner in the Windy Gap project, and we have a 10% stake in the Windy Gap firming project, which will build a new reservoir, Chimney Hollow Reservoir west of Loveland, to firm up that water. And for a long time, we accepted CBT water. It was a requirement for growth, but what it was doing is, as CBT prices escalated, it created unsustainable pricing on our housing. Water is a big component of the price of a house. And as CBT increased in price from, gosh, when I started, it was 6,000 or 7,000. Now it's at 60,000. That was a significant cost for a home to bear, or for a developer and then the ultimate home buyer to bear. And so it's had a huge impact on the Northern Colorado housing market.
Mm-hmm. So being a huge CBT owner, talk about some of the other supplies historically that Greeley turned to besides CBT to allow development to occur within the service area.
Sure. So I guess it really starts with our senior decrees on the Pooter River. The Pooter River is the largest tributary to the South Platte, and Greeley owns some of the most senior decrees on the Pooter River, the number 4, the number 6 decrees. And to my knowledge, those decrees, those senior decrees, they've always produced for the last 120 years. And that's really the backbone of our system. And we can use those year round. Those decrees started not providing enough water in the 1940s and 50s. And so Greeley contracted initially for 15,000 units of the CBT project. And we bought those 15,000 units for $1.50 a piece. Mm-hmm. A pretty good investment if they're now worth 60,000 a piece. As we continued to grow, we had to look for additional water sources. We bought high mountain reservoirs, 7 high mountain reservoirs from an irrigation company. And then we turned to another irrigation company, the Greeley Loveland Company. And we own about over 50% of that company. And we built a second treatment plant in Loveland to treat that water. We have a treatment plant at Boyd Lake in Loveland and one at the toe of Horsetooth Reservoir in Bellevue. We transmit that water through 30 and 40 mile pipelines out east to Greeley. We then participated in Windy Gap, and then we really have upped our purchase of other water rights in the Pooter River Basin. So we're buying shares of irrigation companies in the Pooter River Basin.
I was just going to give a quick map to our
that
audience.
would be helpful. Yeah.
Just to give a sense of the Pooter River, in case you're not familiar with it. I have two different views. This is sort of the simple view. Here, the Pooter Canyon is basically up here. It comes out of a sort of a mountain foothills canyon onto the plains, and the river comes down through Fort Collins, which is this gray blob, and then down to Greeley down here, right before it confluences with the South Platte. And this is just a diagram of the ditches, the major ditches off the Pooter, kind of from the canyon down to Greeley. Adam was mentioning the Greeley treatment plant, which is right here, this little this little square right here. Another maybe helpful view of the Pooter is this Google Earth imagery. It's basically the same area. This is the sort of mouth of the canyon where the blue line starts up here. There's Bellevue, and then Greeley is this urban area down here, and this is the confluence with the South Platte. So you can see that the Pooter River Basin has a lot of, growth and municipal development on its upper area, and a lot of remaining agricultural lands in its eastern portion, sort of north of Greeley and east of Fort Collins. So just, I guess, for orientation more than anything else, this is what the Pooter River Basin looks like. And Greeley's down here, kind of at the near its end, and this little lake, this large reservoir right here is Horsetooth Reservoir, one of the terminal reservoirs of the CBT system. Did you want to add anything to my map, Adam?
No, you got it. That's
cool.
The Pooter River.
So with ag water rights and other sources of supply that you've acquired over the years, I guess what sort of creative sources have you had to turn to, both on the supply side and the demand side? I'll just say maybe not sources, but creative management. Have you had to embrace on the supply side and the demand side to continue to serve new demands, to make water supplies reliable? Can you talk through some of the things Greeley's done over the last 10 years or so to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, one of our guiding philosophies is to acquire water well in advance of when we're going to need it. And so it gives us an advantage, and that's actually what reduces our cash rate for taps. Right now, Greeley has a firm yield, the amount of water we can provide in a drought year, that's well ahead of our annual demand. And we're trying to continue to develop that supply. Greeley has a very large area to grow. Our growth area, I think there's 20 square miles or 25 square miles of area that can still grow. And we're projected to over double in population in the next 40 years. We're 115,000 and we're projected to be at 260,000 by 2065, which is hard to imagine. And to stretch that supply, we've done several innovative things. We're expanding our non-potable system, so we deliver some of that lower Pooter water that we cannot treat, and we pipe it and pump it throughout the city to provide for irrigation water on private development and parks. We're also trying to reduce our demand. We have a water budget structure that for each individual lot, for 35,000 customer or taps in the city, we calculate the amount of irrigated area and the number of residents and single family houses, as well as the use of commercial areas. And we give everybody a budget. And if they stay within that budget, their water rates are cheap. If they exceed that budget, they pay more. And it's a way to right size folks' water use to what is the actual need. We have a conservation program that's incentivizing turf replacement. And then, we're recently finalized the Terry Ranch project, which is really our big future water supply source and storage reservoir.
Yeah, that water budget program, I remember hearing about it years ago, and it seemed to me to be very creative and forward thinking. Do you know, were there predecessors in Colorado who had done it? I know there had been done elsewhere, but are you aware of anyone else in Colorado who had done it before Greeley?
I no, I can't say with surety. I know it was done widely in California and elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool concept. Well, as Caitlin introduced it, I mean, one of the themes of the latest Headwaters magazine is storage, and maybe you saw on the map I was sharing that storage has long been a critical need for water resources management in Colorado. Just the way the rivers flow, with a huge snowmelt flow in the spring and early summer, and then not much for the rest of the year. So you see irrigation reservoirs long established out on the plains to sort of capture and be able to have a water supply later in the season. You've seen a lot of gravel pit storage development by municipal utilities as well as others along the South Platte River and the Pooter River and most rivers on the Front Range. So storage just continues to be something that is important for water resources management and will likely continue to be so. So the Terry Ranch project is a project to create storage for Greeley through an underground aquifer. And can you just maybe briefly explain how an aquifer serves that storage need of a water utility?
Sure. I mean, underground storage is it's just like a surface reservoir. It just happens to be underground. And we operate it the same way. In wet years, water is pumped underground and stored in an aquifer, a layer of typically sand and gravel rock. And in dry years, it's withdrawn and delivered to our customers. Some of the benefits is that underground storage generally has fewer environmental impacts, therefore fewer permitting and less cost than a surface reservoir. It also doesn't have any of the evaporation, and evaporation from these Front Range reservoirs can be significant. Could provide thousands of houses with the amount of water we just evaporate. The downsides are it does require a lot of pumping. It requires pumping to inject water underground. It requires pumping to withdraw water. And then we have to treat the water. It's an EPA regulation that we have to treat the water before injecting it. And then often the water has to be treated after it's taken out. So it is more energy intensive, but when we looked at the Terry Ranch project, which is an underground storage project, we found that the cost of construction compared to a surface reservoir was vastly cheaper and vastly outweighed the increase in operational costs. Underground storage, it's a bit new in Colorado. Some of the South Metro water providers have been doing it for a decade or so, but it's very common throughout the U.S., California, Arizona. Terry Ranch is the first one in northern Colorado.
Yeah. And I know Greeley spent some years trying to raise Seaman Dam and enlarge Seaman Reservoir. And I believe in talking with you previously, Terry Ranch, the project concept really spun out of thinking about alternatives to this surface water storage expansion project that really was stuck in a permitting divot. So can you just explain like the thinking that Greeley went through and turning from a surface reservoir project that was, I would say, pretty standard for how municipalities might increase storage to this alternative and what that process looked like?
Yeah, let me maybe share my screen here. Can you all see that? So for a long time, Greeley was proposing to enlarge Milton Seaman Reservoir. It's an existing reservoir, and it's an on-channel reservoir, and we were proposing to raise it from about 5,000 acre feet, which is this light blue, to well over 50,000 acre feet, which is this dark blue line. And you can see that is large. We would have large impacts, impacting wetlands, stream channel, critical habitat for an threatened endangered species. And as we progressed in the permitting process, it just became more and more apparent that we may not get a permit. And it was unlikely that we were going to get a permit because of these environmental impacts. And we spent 15 years and $19 million in that permitting process. These Front Range Reservoir permitting processes, as probably many on the call know, they're long, they're expensive, and they're risky. And so we started looking at what could we do that doesn't require these burdensome federal permits, something we could do that's cheaper. And we really threw everything on the table. We looked at well over 100 alternatives, and one that came up was this Terry Ranch project. And so, you know, in a way, the permitting process we follow is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires that alternatives are evaluated before any federal decision is made, like issuing a permit. Mm-hmm. In this case, it may have worked. It forced us to look at an alternative that wasn't on our radar, it wasn't planned, but it ultimately had fewer environmental impacts and worked out for Greeley.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, a big benefit is you didn't need a federal NEPA permit or go through the federal NEPA permitting process to get a 404 permit to build and construct the Terry Ranch project. So what's the current expected timeline to build, I guess, the initial phase of Terry Ranch? Do you have one in place yet?
Sure. Let me fast forward just briefly. What is Terry Ranch? It's a large underground aquifer up against the Wyoming border in northeast Weld County, and it's about 1.2 million acre feet of decreed water. So it's a very large source, and it's very prime for underground storage. And we'd simply withdraw the water out of the aquifer and deliver it through a new 30-mile pipe that connects into our existing infrastructure. And then we would pump water after treating it from our Bellevue plant and use that same pipe. It's a bidirectional pipe, and inject it underground. Because it doesn't require any federal permits, we're actually planning on constructing starting next year. And we'll build this very slowly over time. We don't need it right away. It is our drought supply. We're not going to use this year in and year out. It's only when our surface water runs out, because it's more expensive to operate. And we're gonna try to cash flow it. So we'll build it as we have revenue. We're not going to try to build it all at once. And that is really an advantage to our customers. That means we can keep our rates low. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but Terry Ranch is a bison ranch. So there's a lot of bison up there. So will there still be bison up on the ranch even when you've got your project in place?
Yeah, it's pretty fun working up there. You know, occupational hazards typically don't talk about bull bison, you know, wanting to rub on your equipment. And but yeah, it's a working bison ranch, about 1,000 head, and it's undeveloped, and we hope to keep it that way.
Cool. You touched upon what I think is probably one of the coolest aspects, separate from underground storage and sort of bringing that to northern Colorado, which I think you're spot on. It's a system of storage that's used in other places a lot. But the other cool thing about Terry Ranch is sort of the financing behind it and how Greeley has structured paying for this project. And I think this is a really cool aspect about how it's funded. You mentioned cash flowing it so that you don't take on, you know, huge debt. But can you just describe how you've worked with the private entity to fund this project? And I'd like you to touch upon how you've really managed risk for City of Greeley in that financing process.
Sure. Well, we are definitely using a unique purchase structure, one that I don't know if there's other examples in Colorado. So this project was developed by a private company called Wingfoot Water Resources. And I know there's a lot of debate in the Colorado community about private interest in water, but in this case, it worked out. because Wingfoot developed the decree for the groundwater and then proved out the source. Many northern Colorado communities knew about that there could be potential water up there, but we didn't know how much, and we didn't know if it was safe and the pumping rates were or the water quality. Wingfoot invested, tens of millions of dollars to prove it out. They drilled 5 large diameter municipal grade wells, did a suite of testing, and then they packaged up all the rights to make this work, like the surface access easement, exclusive leases to other water and land. And they packaged up a water source, and then they looked to sell it. And Greeley became interested, again, out of our alternatives analysis. But we looked at purchasing it in a different way. So instead of paying cash, what we agreed to, and we just closed April 6th. Instead of paying cash, we issued Wingfoot what we call raw water dedication credits. These raw water credits are redeemable to meet our raw water dedication requirements. So, and we issued Wingfoot 12,000 of these credits. Each credit is worth 1 acre foot of dedication. And these don't represent wet water. They just represent a paper contract that Greeley will accept these credits to meet our raw water dedication. And so Wingfoot once we issued these credits, Wingfoot's going to sell those to developers. Mm-hmm. And that's how they make their money. And then these developers will turn those credits into us instead of turning in water or cash, and we'll give the water tap. By issuing these credits, bottom line, what that means for us is we're foregoing those future revenue of cash from development. But that's a real advantage for us because that cash we would have gotten for development, we would have used to build storage and buy water. In this case, we get all that up front, and then we're foregoing future revenue. In addition, we recognize that probably the value of the credits exceed the value of the assets, and so we negotiated that the seller would pay us $125 million. So actually, at closing, we don't pay anything, and we actually get $125 million plus all the assets. Mm-hmm. And what's appealing about this is that we have been able to shift a lot of our risk onto the seller. For a typical water supply project, for example, Milton Seaman, we would have issued a very large upfront bond, and then we would have relied on future development to pay off that bond. And that's risky because you're counting on new development to pay off a past debt, and development comes in fits and spurts. It crashed in the 2008 housing crisis, and that debt requires payment, regardless. And that's really risky. In this situation, we already have the asset, the water and the storage locked up, and it's on Wingfoot to ride the roller coaster of development to make their money. Mm-hmm. And so we shifted all that risk onto the seller.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I think that's one of the cool, innovative aspects of the project. And just to, I guess, repeat what Adam said, the way I'm thinking about it is, if the project was built and financed, I would say in a traditional sense, and growth didn't occur for whatever reason, it's likely Greeley customers would be seeing rate increases because Greeley would have held a bond that they have to make payments on. And usually bonds are so well rated in municipal systems because you've got a large ratepayer base that if bad stuff happens, there's always a fallback revenue through rates. So I think it's really cool and unique how, just as Adam said, it's the private party who's riding that roller coaster of growth and development activity, and could definitely profit from it, but that risk isn't on the utility. The utility is sort of not totally immune from it, but at least protected a bit from it. Well, I've got other questions, but it's 10 minutes till, and I thought let's give the audience some time for questions if they have any.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So if anyone has questions, you can use in the bottom of your screen and the reactions button, there should be a raise hand option. So you can raise your hand or you can type them in to the chat. So it looks like, and feel free to turn your camera on if you're raising your hand, and you can turn your microphone on and ask the question. But we have a question that already came in the chat that says, does it concern you if Wingfoot resells those credits for CBT shares?
No, and the reason is we're going to continue to accept water, cash, or credit, and annually we're going to set a cash value. Currently, it's $36,500. We assume that no developer in the right mind is going to pay for a credit at a rate higher than what they could just pay the city in cash. And they're not going to go buy CBT at $60,000 an acre foot when they can buy cash in lieu at $36,500 or credits for less than that. Greeley effectively sets the price ceiling on this secondary market by setting our annual cash in lieu rate. And so while it's a secondary market and we can't control it, we do in a way by setting the price ceiling.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, as Adam touched upon this in the earlier comments about the diversity in cash prices for new service among municipalities, but I mean, the current Greeley cash in lieu rate of 31,000, in my view, is really a pretty good deal. When you're looking across the Front Range, you know, there's a complex backstory about why different cash in lieu prices are set the way they are. But you know, if you surveyed all the cash in lieu rates across northern Colorado, $30,000 or $31,000 per acre foot is pretty favorable to development. So I would expect that Wingfoot is cognizant of this, and they have some comfort that Greeley will be a good place to develop and grow for you know, time to come. Just my own thoughts on sort of maybe what they're thinking.
Yeah, they definitely evaluated Greeley inside and out, and we evaluated them. You know, we did a lot of diligence on each other, as you would if you get into a long-term relationship. Mm-hmm. We dated for a while before we married.
Yeah. Follow-up question, which I'm going to read to you, Adam, is the following. The marginal cost of new supply is thought to be more than 31,000 per acre foot. So how does that pass the right price signal on to development and developers? I guess what price signal do you think you're sending to developers with your $31,000 cash in lieu rate?
We want to see, our city council wants to see development. They want to see jobs in Greeley, and our cash in lieu rate reflects that. But it also acknowledges that Greeley develops new supply not by going out on the market and buying CBT. And we're actually prohibited from doing that through various rules of Northern Water, which controls the CBT system. We can develop water cheaper by buying cheaper agricultural water rights and storing them in Terry Ranch and firming them up. So our cash in lieu rate is pretty close to what our actual cost of developing new water supplies is.
Mm-hmm. And one thing Adam mentioned earlier that I think is important to bring out is the older cities in northern Colorado, Fort Collins, Greeley, who have had decades of water acquisition. You know, they basically can provide a cheaper cash in lieu rate than somebody who has no ability to buy into the existing system, and they're developing water resources just as fast as growth is occurring. I mean, for instance, I can't remember what Fort Collins' current cash in lieu rate is, but I want to say it's 20-something thousand per acre foot. And again, the reason Fort Collins utilities can offer a $20,000 per acre foot cash in lieu rate, might not be exactly that, so don't quote me, but something in that ballpark, is because you're basically buying into a system that was built 20, 30 years ago, and they have the capacity to serve new growth with that system. And just to contrast that with the community who either can only go buy CBT units, they have no infrastructure to develop a water supply other than a CBT reservoir, or has to acquire other ag rights that have seen price appreciation, you know, there's usually a limited amount of water that communities can turn to for new development. And if you're forced to go buy it at market rates today and there's no buy-in to the existing system, you will see higher cash and lieu rates as a result. Another question came in: are there long-term ecological concerns with underground aquifer storage? I'm assuming at the ranch property.
No, you know, we did extensive diligence. In 8 months, we did $3.2 million worth of diligence. We literally had an army of people up there looking at the environmental conditions, testing water quality. We took 7,000 water quality tests to make sure this was safe. And injecting water underground in a already wet aquifer, the amount of water that we're going to inject compared to the massive volume, it does not have earthquake potential. It's not going to create new water coming out of the ground. There's really no ecological impacts of this project except building the infrastructure underground, which we acknowledge has environmental impacts, but typically can be mitigated to a great extent. And what you'll see after this project is built out is small wellheads, a very small water treatment plant compared to what you know, we have now, and underground pipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A comment was made, which I separate from that topic, on CBT. We've been talking about CBT at 60,000 per unit, and just the comment was that, well, that only yields you 0.7 of an acre foot on average. So the equivalent price is actually up 80,000 something, almost $90,000 per acre foot. So in other words, just to boil that down, Greeley's current cash and lieu rate is about 1/3 of what it would cost to go buy CBT water on the open market, you know, somewhere around that. So it's cost effective.
We have a hand up. Will, if you want to unmute yourself and.
Terry Ranch looks like a really interesting project. Is there going to be a slurry, a clay wall around that at all, or is it just mounting the water? So I was wondering about how you keep dominion over the water supply, water rights.
Yeah, so it's a decreed non-tributary water source, and the state engineer's office is classified as a non-tributary aquifer. And in non-tributary aquifers as such, there doesn't need to be a liner or slurry walls because the water is very isolated. It's very deep. It does not move. It moves about 1 mile every 50 years. And so it's the dominion and control is represented in just its non-tributary nature.
Okay, great. Thanks.
In Greeley, I see a comment. Greeley is definitely not the cheapest. We know we're making a big deal about it, but Fort Collins is cheaper. Longmont is 17,683. I think we fall generally in the middle of the pack, low to middle. Loveland's higher, Windsor's higher, but generally we're middle of the pack.
Yeah. Well, it's 2 o'clock. I hope everyone enjoyed the last hour and learned something, and enjoyed the conversation between Adam and I guess look out for that issue of Headwaters Magazine on storage. And Caitlin, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say to wrap it up, but I just want to say thanks to everyone to participating. It was a fun hour.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thanks for talking, Adam and Brad. It was really interesting. We have recorded the webinar, so I will try and get that ready to share this afternoon. If not this afternoon, I'll email you all on Tuesday of next week. So it will be available to you, and eventually, probably like a month from now, we'll post it on our website. That will be available, and it looks like Adam shared his contact information. So reach out with any further follow-up questions, and thanks everyone so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thanks for having us, Caitlin. Thanks for putting it together. Take care.
Bye.